For it is as if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. The one who had received the 5 talents went off at once and traded with them and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had the 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. Then the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, Master, you added over to me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trusty slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I'll put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And the one with the 2 talents also came forward, saying, Master, you handed over to me 2 talents. See, I have made 2 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But his master replied, You wicked and lazy slave. You knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with the 10 talents. For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But for those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.
Thank you, Joyce, for reading. This is the parable of the talents. Several years ago, the church had all the money stolen from their offering plate one Sunday. Later in the week, a package of cash with no return address arrived in the mail. The pastor realized upon opening it that there was a great deal more money than was originally stolen. When the next Sunday came around, she thanked the anonymous thief for his or her recompense. And then she added, Whoever you are, in addition to thanking you, I'm wondering, could you do the same thing next week? On the surface, one might think that the parable of the talents is also about increasing financial abundance. But the surface is not a good place to stop when it comes to parables. Parables are challenging. I often wonder if they were just as challenging to the people of Jesus' time, or did they have a better understanding of his figurative language? I would venture to guess that Jesus' listeners were equally challenged by his seemingly obscure and paradoxical meanings. Many times we hear Jesus' frustration with the disciples because they just don't get it. The so-called parable of the talents is a good one for us to struggle with. On first reading, or maybe because of interpretations we've heard in the past, it seems to promote muscular financial investments or intense stewardship practices. And it seems like the landowner may refer to God, in which case the third slave's harsh and fearsome perception of him is troubling. So how do we peel this apart? In the first place, whenever we're dealing with figurative language, the meaning will not be literal in any way. There will likely be layers of context, past understandings, figures of speech and ancient rhetoric, plus Jesus' propensity to turn things upside down. If the moral of the story is not to use or invest your talents or wealth or else, then what is the gist of it? When we listen to it within the context of what Jesus has already said about the kingdom of heaven, and when we keep in mind Jesus' usual invitation to a reversal of expectations, then we can begin to unpack some possibilities. Jesus has already described the kingdom of heaven, which is both now, with us now, and not yet fully realized. He's described it as a quality of living that includes love of God, neighbor, and enemy, that looks out for the least of all, a state of being in which humanity cares for one another and for all creation, a promise of unending love and mercy. So if our interpretation of a particular passage does not seem to fit Jesus' criteria, then either the writer or we are probably not understanding something. What if this story is about God trusting us with incredible and abundant blessings rather than about condemnation? What if it is about risking everything for the sake of sharing Jesus' teachings and commands, demonstrating the good news of the gospel, God's abundant love? We are called to reach out without fear, and we are invited into God's own joy. The third servant was given abundance, as were the other two, but was unable to receive fully and share it because of his perhaps faulty perception of the harshness of the landowner or his fear of losing what he had. With the help of preacher David Lose, here are some elements to consider. 1, the landowner entrusts each servant with an extraordinary sum of money. In today's dollars, a single talent would approach a value of $1.5 million. It represents about 15 to 20 years of labor, an incredible amount that Jesus' listeners probably laughed at. No one would do that. 2, after placing these extraordinary sums in the hands of his servants, the master goes on a journey and does not come back for a long time, giving his servants tremendous leeway and a great deal of time to handle these sums. 3, neither of the first two servants react to the landowner's trust negatively. In fact, they are empowered to go out and trade, taking risks with the confidence of their master. 4, the third servant gives no evidence that the master has actually ever been harsh. He makes an unsubstantiated charge. 5, the master neither confirms nor denies the servant's assessment, but there is a subtle note of surprise or perhaps annoyance in his response. So you knew, did you? As for the sticky part about the judgment at the end of the story, throwing someone into the outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, It's one of Matthew's favorite hyperboles to make folks sit up and pay attention. Such judgments may not be as extreme to Matthew's ears as they are to ours. And it is also likely referring to the self-inflicted consequences of living in debilitating fear and not experiencing the increase in wisdom and love that comes from sharing it. The opportunity to further Jesus' work in the world has been squandered. So the landowner may represent Jesus rather than God. Jesus was the one who would be going away for a while, the one who died and returned and who continues to return to our lives. And Jesus' warning is that the outcome of playing it safe, not caring, not loving passionately, not investing yourself, not risking anything, is something akin to death, like being banished to the outer darkness. The third servant is not so much condemned as he condemns himself to a place, a life that does not know joy. Fear can be a major player in preventing us from fully living into God's desired life for humanity. In this time when fear and disease and discrimination and dishonesty and violence and lack of trust have all gone viral, not to mention inflammatory Facebook postings, we are all too familiar with the effects of fear. Our bodies are wired to react in predictable ways: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. They are all subconscious reactions. Flight means running away or trying to escape a situation. Fight is an aggressive response, and to freeze is to become incapable of doing anything or even making a choice. The fawn response has been recognized more recently and involves doing something to try to please someone to avoid conflict. These are natural responses to protect us from danger. But sometimes we get stuck in these modes of being, even when there is no imminent danger. Generally, after an initial fight, flight, or freeze response to something we fear, we are able to do something to release ourselves from being trapped in that mode. We can then carry on despite the fear. The third servant in our parable was unable to let go and get beyond his self-manufactured fear. And so he did nothing. Jill Duffield offers this helpful interpretation of the parable. Perhaps the talents in this tale represent wisdom, seeing and understanding the presence and will of Jesus. The first two servants are those who recognize the Messiah and follow and learn more about who God is and what God requires. Those who perceive rightly the character of God act accordingly, and in turn gain more wisdom. It is in the practice of faith that our faith deepens and grows. In turn, when we fail to exercise it, it atrophies and is diminished. A life of faith requires taking risks for the sake of the gospel. It demands of us enough trust to let go of our talents, our gifts, our resources, to be used in service to the God who entrusted us with them. It is in our letting go that we find freedom and expand our faith. End quote. So, how are we doing at letting go and expanding our wisdom, knowledge, and love by using it in service to God? Jesus invites us to be his disciples, to live our lives as fully as possible by investing them, by risking, by expanding the horizons of our responsibilities. It's not so much believing ideas about him as it is following him. It is to be bold and brave, to reach high and care deeply. This risk-taking living to which Jesus calls us is not about taking risks for the sake of taking risks, but for the sake of human life and creation itself, to make God's love and compassion known so that hearts and lives might be changed, to make God's goodness known to all. God's saving work through Jesus is continued on through our work and our willingness to risk everything in response to God's extravagant giving. What does this risk-taking discipleship look like? When we look at the world around us and see individuals or leaders who do not use the knowledge and resources at hand to make a difference in the lives of others, especially in a time of crisis or suffering, we see that, and it can be upsetting, to say the least. But there are also positive examples that shine. In the movie Just Mercy, based on the book of the same title by Brian Stevenson, we hear the story of Stevenson's work for justice. After graduating from Harvard, he might have had his pick of lucrative jobs as a lawyer. Instead, he headed to Alabama to defend those wrongly condemned, founding and working through a nonprofit called the Equal Justice Initiative. He could have chosen to invest his career in a safe, lucrative law practice, but instead felt called to serve those who were suffering unjustly. Eva Ansley and her family provided housing when Stevenson came to the town and worked in his office for nothing to begin with, except the belief that it was the right thing to do, even when her family was threatened. She easily could have taken the safe route of investing her energies in something less threatening. My friend Rachel, who had just watched Just Mercy, said, "I guess I see this parable of the talents not as talents given as a reward for anything I've done, but talents for God's kingdom, where what is needed is provided, and how I invest what has been given to me also has been given with the gift of a Holy Spirit, who, Paul reminds me, will give gifts of love, joy, peace, and a yearning for justice and mercy. In these days that seem so dark, it is good for me to be reminded again that Jesus sees God's kingdom in a way where he tells us to invest lavishly, to risk for the sake of just mercy." Thank you to Rachel. I believe there is a message for the church as well. God's extravagant love and mercy are gifts we have been given, along with the talents and other resources we have. The church itself is challenged by the parable of the talents to risk lavishly for the furtherance of God's kingdom and for the well-being of all people. What will we do with what we have and the future God gives us to work in? Will we react out of fear? Will we fight against or flee from anything that requires us to risk changes? Will we freeze ourselves in time and so risk becoming a place of gnashing teeth because we refused to invest in a Spirit-inspired future? Or will we dare to dream and seek the new creation to which God is constantly calling? Will we engage in extravagant hospitality? We may not be able to do it in person right now, but we can prepare the way, and we can use the resources that are available right now: email, online, face-to-face options, phone calls, and old-fashioned letter writing. Will we explore brave new forms of ministry? Will we live out our stated goals, the Matthew 25 initiative and our Earth Care designation? Will we do justice, practice loving kindness, and seek to walk humbly and faithfully with God? Perhaps the parable of the talents should be renamed a parable of abundance. God's abundance of love must be shared. And when it is, it grows. It's like the old Girl Scout song that says, love is something, if you give it away, you end up having more. And the more love there is in the world, the more light there is. And the more light there is, then fewer will find themselves in places of darkness and weeping and gnashing of teeth. An old rabbi once asked his students, "How do you know when the night is over and the day has dawned?" He himself gave the answer. It is when you can look into the face of any man or woman and see there the face of your brother or sister. Because if you cannot do that, no matter how bright it is, you are still in the night. Our actions of love grow and spread and bring light to the darkness. We are not to bury what God has given. We are not to hide our resources and talents under a bushel. We are not to let fear hold us back from sharing God's love, but rather we are to be beacons of light. God loves us, accepts us, believes in us, trusts us, and invites us into joy so that we might go out to live with courage, compassion, and confidence. Thanks be to God.
Amen.